It was the spring of 1950, and Margaret sat by the window of her small apartment, gazing out at the bustling streets of New York City. She was a young woman in love, her heart full of dreams and hopes for the future. The object of her affection was Thomas, a kind and thoughtful man she had met the previous summer. They had spent countless evenings together, walking through Central Park, talking about their dreams and sharing their deepest thoughts, but now Thomas was far away, stationed overseas as a soldier. Margaret missed him terribly, and her only solace was the letters they exchanged. One evening, with the scent of blooming flowers wafting through the open window, Margaret sat down to write a letter. This one was different. It was more than just an update on her life or a note of encouragement. It was a love letter, one that confessed her deepest feelings and hopes for their future together. Margaret poured her heart into the letter, writing about how much she loved him, how she dreamed of their future together, and how she couldn't imagine her life without him. She sealed the letter with a kiss, tucked it into an envelope, and carefully addressed it to Thomas. With a heart full of love and anticipation, she walked to the post office and mailed it, never imagining that this letter would take a journey spanning decades. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Margaret waited anxiously for a reply from Thomas. But the letter never came. She sent more letters, but received only a few brief responses from Thomas, who seemed increasingly distant. The war dragged on and the world around them changed. Margaret's hope began to fade, and with it the vibrant love she had once felt for Thomas. She couldn't understand why he had stopped writing, why he seemed to have disappeared from her life. Unbeknownst to her, the letters she had poured her heart into had been lost in the chaos of war, misplaced in a military mailroom, and never reached Thomas. He too wondered why Margaret had stopped writing, not knowing that the letter he was waiting for had never arrived. Confused and heartbroken, both of them slowly drifted apart, their once bright future dimming with each passing day. The years passed, and Margaret, now in her 30s, met another man, James, who was kind and dependable. He offered her a stable life, and though she never felt the same deep passion for him that she had for Thomas, she grew to love him in her own way. They married, had children, and settled into a quiet, comfortable life. Yet late at night, when the world was silent, Margaret would sometimes think of Thomas, wondering what had happened to him, where he was, and whether he ever thought of her. Thomas too moved on with his life. After the war, he returned home, disillusioned and broken. He never understood why Margaret had stopped writing, and in his grief he distanced himself from the memories of their time together. He eventually met a woman named Anne, who helped him heal. They married and had a family, but there was always a part of Thomas that remained untouched, a part of him that still belonged to Margaret, though he would never admit it. Decades later, in the spring of 2024, a post office in a small town was undergoing renovations. In a dusty, forgotten corner of the building, a worker discovered an old yellowed envelope addressed to Thomas with a postmark from 1950. The envelope was unopened, and the worker, curious about its contents, brought it to the attention of the postmaster. Realizing the significance of the letter, the postmaster decided to deliver it, even though it had been over 70 years since it was first mailed. The letter was sent to Thomas's last known address, and by a twist of fate, it reached his widow, Anne, who was now in her 80s. Anne opened the envelope, her hands trembling as she read the words that Margaret had written so many years ago. She realized with a pang of sadness that this letter had been meant for her husband, a letter that might have changed the course of his life, and hers had it arrived on time. Anne, moved by the letter, decided to find Margaret, who was now an elderly woman living alone in a small apartment in New York. When Anne arrived at Margaret's door, she explained who she was and handed her the letter. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it, her eyes filling with tears as she recognized the words she had written so long ago. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past rushing back to her. As she read the letter, Margaret was overcome with a mixture of emotions, love, regret, and a deep, aching sadness. She realized that this letter, had it reached Thomas, might have changed everything. They might have been together, living the life they had dreamed of. But now it was too late. Thomas was gone, and all that remained were memories and what-ifs. After Anne left, Margaret sat alone with the letter, her heart heavy with the weight of what could have been. She thought about Thomas, about the life they never had, and about the choices they had both made. She realized that life had moved on, and so had she, but the love she had felt for him would always be a part of her. Margaret decided to visit Thomas's grave, bringing the letter with her. As she stood before the headstone, she whispered the words she had written all those years ago, finally giving voice to the love that had been lost to time. She placed the letter on his grave, letting it rest there as a symbol of the love that had endured, even if it had never been fully realized. In the quiet of the cemetery, with the wind gently rustling the leaves, Margaret felt a sense of peace. She had loved and lost, but she had also lived. And in the end, she knew that the love she and Thomas had shared, even if it had been brief and incomplete, was a love that had transcended time, a love that would remain with her until the end of her days.